All right, we're going to go over the AKS 9 to 11 test. Question 1 says, determine whether or not the triangles in this figure are congruent. If so, write a congruent statement. So as I'm looking at this, I notice the angle S is congruent to angle J. Side SD is congruent to side JO. And angle D is congruent to angle O. As I go around the triangle and I label, this is an angle that's marked as being congruent to something else. This is a side that's marked as congruent, and this is an angle that's marked as congruent. So following in the shortest distance, I see that I've got angle, side, angle. And angle, side, angle is one of our approved congruency theorems. And so this tells me that yes, these two triangles are congruent. So this is the postulate that we use. And now let's write our congruent statement. So the congruent statement is where you match up the corresponding pieces of the triangles to write the congruent triangle statement. So I'm going to start with triangle YSD is congruent to triangle. So the first one you can label, however, I decided to go YSD. So in the second triangle, I have to match up S and J go together since they were marked as being congruent to each other. D and O must go together because they were marked as being congruent. And Y and N go together because they were not marked as congruent. So since I started with Y, I have to start with N. Then I went to S, which is here. S was corresponding with J, so I have to go to J next. And then we ended with D, so I must end with the letter O. And there's the congruent statement for this one. Now, your congruent statement could have been different. You could have said SDY was congruent to. If you said S first, you'd have to say J first here. And then D and O, Y and N. And there's various different answers that you could have had here, okay? As long as you match up the corresponding pieces correctly. All right, the next part, given that I have the congruency statement FTB, triangle FTB is congruent to triangle GME, I need to complete the two by matching up what they are corresponding with. So angle T is congruent to what? Well, here's T, it's the middle letter, so it has to correspond with the middle letter in the other triangle. So I can say angle T is congruent to angle M. All right, now we're going to look at BF. So BF goes from the first letter to, or the last letter to the first letter. So again, I have to go from the last letter to the first letter. So BF is congruent to EG. All right, determine whether or not the two triangles are congruent. If so, we're going to fill in the congruency statement. Now, looking at this picture, I have two sides marked as congruent and two angles, and that's it. But there is something else that we know. Anytime we see two triangles that meet at a line or a point, we have extra information. So these two meet at line YW. They both touch this line right here. We know that the line segment YW is congruent to itself by the reflexive property. So we can also mark this one as congruent as well. Now that that is marked, I can see that I have a side marked, an angle, and then another side. So that tells me that I have an example of side, angle, side here. And side, angle, side is a correct congruency theorem. And so therefore these two are in fact congruent. So I'm going to write my congruent statement, triangle, and I'm going to go X, Y, W is congruent to triangle. Here is X, and X corresponds with Z. So we're going to do triangle Z. Then I went here to Y, so I have to go to Y, and then down to W. All right, let's look at this proof here. So point N is the midpoint of OM. That is given, and LM is parallel to PO. And if you even want to mark that just to help yourself remember those are parallel, you can. All right, the next thing says that MN is congruent to ON. Well, MN is right here. Congruent to ON is right here. Those two are congruent because we were told that N is the midpoint of that side. And so therefore, the reason that we can say this is by definition of midpoint. So remember, MO has midpoint N. Therefore, I know that it cuts it perfectly into two halves. So by definition of midpoint, we can say those two halves are congruent. The next one is alternate interior angles are congruent. Well, I am trying to pick one of these answer choices. Look, they all are the same except for the first one, which says ML is congruent to PO. Those two are not angles, so it cannot possibly be the first answer choice. But let's look at angle M and angle O and see why they are correct here. So angle M is right here, angle O is right here, and we were given that these two sides are parallel. So if you kind of extend them out, you could see how this is an example of two parallel lines cut by a transversal, creating that Z shape, giving us alternate interior angles. And so we'll say angle M is congruent to angle O. All right, the next one says that angle MNL, so that's this angle here, is congruent to angle ONP. How are these two congruent? Notice they meet at this common point N and they are across from each other. So these are examples of vertical angles. And the last one, how can we say that these two triangles are congruent? Let's go back and mark what we know. We know that these two sides are congruent. We found that M was congruent to O, and the vertical angles were congruent as well. So if I label the things that I know, we have an angle, a side, and another angle. So my reason here would be angle, side, angle. So the correct answer is this one. All right, looking at the next one, I'm given that the triangles are congruent. I need to solve for the missing pieces, or solve for x. So if SEB is congruent to NRT, that means SE must correspond with NR. No, that's too close. EB must correspond with RT. And again, I'm just going in order as they're listed here. SE, NR, and EB, RT. And the last one I'll do is BS corresponds with TN. So now we can easily see which sides match up and should be congruent. So we know that SE is 15, SB is 21, EB is 11, and NR is 3x plus 3. What is the value of x? Well, x is right here with the 3x plus 3. And we know that that side NR corresponds with side SE. They are corresponding, which means they are congruent. And so I can actually set up an equation here by setting them equal since they are congruent. And now this will allow me to solve for x. So I'm going to go ahead and subtract 3 from both sides. I get 12 equals 3x. Next, I will divide both sides by 3, and 4 equals x. So there's our answer for that one. All right, what additional information would you need to prove these two by angle, angle, side? Right now I have angle, side. And I want angle, angle, side. So I need my other angle to come before this one. That means if I knew angle B was congruent to angle E, I would have angle, angle, side. So it's B is congruent to E. I could right away knock off the two middle choices because if I want angle, angle, side, I know that I need two angles and only one side. But you might have gotten confused with angle C and angle F. So let's take a look at why that one is not the correct answer choice here. So right now I have angle, I have side. If I knew C and F were congruent, what would I have? I would have angle, side, angle. And that's not what we want. We want angle, angle, side. So it's really important that you're careful about the order that these pieces go around the triangle.